Hello YouTube, this is Matt Pullen. I know I haven't done a chess video in a while, so to compensate, I really hate doing these, but I'm going to make a two-part chess video on a trappy line. Well, not a trappy line, it's just a bad line, rather, in the Veresov, which is the opening that I've been playing now for a few months. And the Veresov starts out d4. It is a queen-pawn opening. And after knight f6, which is a common first move because it contests the e4 square, white plays knight to c3, which threatens to advance the pawn to e4 right away. Now the main line of the Veresov is black moving the pawn up to d5, contesting the e4 square, and then white plays bishop to g5. And it can go in a wide variety of directions from there. But those are the main next two moves, d5 and bishop g5. However, in this video, we will be looking at e6. And the rationale for e6 might be this. It looks sort of like the Nimzo-Indian defense, which is white playing c4 on move 2, and then black plays e6. And after knight c3, moving the knight behind the c-pawn, and preparing to play pawn to e4, black plays bishop to b4, which by pinning this knight, it removes it from the fight for e4. So this is the highest scoring defense in chess, the Nimzo-Indian. And if it's the only thing that black knows against queen pawn, then he might try to play it against the Veresov. So that might explain why e6 is seen sometimes. Because after white plays pawn to e4, then black plays bishop to b4 sometimes. This is really the main point of this video, to look at this sort of Nimzo-Indian-esque variation of the Veresov, and I will show you why this is not a good idea for black to go into. But first, let me talk a little bit about this move. I used to play bishop to g5 in this variation. This is the move that Nigel Davies recommends. Admittedly, it's the most likely to aim black for uncharted waters. But objectively, there are like at least 5 very possible, plausible defenses that black can use in this position after bishop to g5. He can counterpin with bishop to b4. He can kick the bishop with h6, which is the move I would play if I were black in this position. He can play c5. He can play bishop to e7, breaking the pin. Or he can play d5. And against d5, in order to get any action in the center, because the white c-pawn is blocked, he's going to have to play pawn to e4 at some point. And when he does that, it will transpose to a French variation of some kind. Now, white can delay the French transposition by playing knight f3 and seeing what black will do before playing his pawn to e4 or not. And even though my my only tournament win against an international master is with playing knight f3 in this position, objectively it's not that dangerous for black if he knows what he's doing in the French. So instead of bishop to g5, I play right now I play e4. And if I had known that so many people were going to play bishop b4 against me, I would have started playing e4 much sooner. After e4, the most plausible and strongest move for black is to play d5, challenging the center. And this has just transposed into a French defense, which is a king-pawn opening, which presumably black knows something about, or maybe not. So white can play the Steinitz with pawn to e5 pushing immediately, or he can play the classical with bishop to g5, and there are some other moves as well. But again, we basically just transposed into a French. Aside from the French position with pawn to d5, there are really not a lot of strong moves for black here. Really like 1.5 solid options for black. The half is like the Benoni attempt with c5. And if he tries to play the Benoni, which should be good for white, by the way, because he has not committed the pawn to c4, then black has to be very careful about his move order. For instance, if he plays pawn to d5, if white plays pawn to d5 rather, then black should play like, a6 or d6 or maybe even e5. If he tries to play pawn takes pawn, then after white advances pawn to e5, black is already worse because this d5 square is not defended. So after this knight moves, there's going to be the threat of knight takes d5. And if black plays d4 trying to trade the knights, then after pawn takes, queen e2 check, and black is going to have to block with his bishop on e7 and lose it. So really, d5 and possibly c5 are the only good moves for black here. If he tries to play bishop to b4, then he will get into a lot of trouble. Now, the point of bishop b4 in the Nimzo is to prevent white from playing pawn to e4. But white already has pawn to e4 in this case. And after, black is threatening to take on e4 because this bishop is pinned. But it's white's move, and he can play pawn to e5, attacking the knight. And already we see a drawback of the early bishop development to a b4. Black is hanging his g7 pawn. And after this knight moves, white is going to play queen to g4, attacking the g7 pawn and gaining a lot of space on the king side. So, what is there for black? His knight is attacked. If he plays knight to e4, then white plays queen to g4. Now, in addition to threatening this pawn on g7, white is threatening to capture a piece on e4. So this situation forces black to respond by trading on c3. And we're going to look at this later. Knight d5 is better, because even then, white will play queen to g4. Maybe black is assuming that white will has to do something passive to defend on c3, like maybe bring the knight to e2 or the bishop to d2 or something, because black has two attackers and white only has one defender. But white can gain an advantage by temporarily sacrificing the c3 square and playing queen to g4 with a counterattack on g7. Now, here, black can capture on c3, which does not work out very well for him. And I think this is going to be a two-part video. So the second part will cover what happens if black takes on c3. But we'll look at two other tries here. The safe line is g6. This prevents any sort of a capture. But look at how weak this g6 move has made the dark squares on black's king side. Because the dark squares on the king side are so weak, we really want to have this be an unopposed bishop. So let's try to get black to trade off his guy on dark squares by playing a3. Now, let's see what there is for black here. If he takes on c3, then after b takes, we've gotten our unopposed dark square bishop, which can start drooling at the thought of coming to g5 and invading f6, g7, etc. Knight takes is just a blunder, because after bishop to g5, black will lose the queen. So here, instead of taking on c3, it's probably better for black to maintain the bishop. After bishop to a5, white will play b4. And in addition to threatening the bishop, white is threatening to play bishop to g5. And also possibly like bring the knight into e4 and come to f6 for check. It's very unpleasant. So bishop to e7 is probably black's best bet to survive. Now white can play queen to f3, and this threatens to win a pawn on d5. So black should probably capture. And after queen takes, d5, knight f3, white has a very good French-style position where it will be hard for black to get in c5. And also, there are some weaknesses still around the black king side. So that is g6, the safest and maybe best move in the position. Black can also castle to defend this with his king. And castling allows white to win an exchange by playing bishop to h6. This threatens checkmate, and the pawn cannot take because it is pinned. So after g6, bishop takes, queen takes, knight ge2, we've reached a position that's kind of reminiscent of the pin variation of the Sicilian, where black sacrifices an exchange. But I mean, even in the pin variation, it's considered to be insufficient compensation. And here, black has even less compensation because the queen can't come to c5 to pressure the knight on c3 any further. So in the next video, we'll take a look at what happens after knight takes on c3.